I've been living in this cabin for 40 years. Not that I've completely cut myself off from people, no. I go to the village once a month for salt, matches, and cartridges. Chat with the headman, pick up the mail. But this is my world, from the river to the rocky stream. And the taiga is with me. Taiga is my dog. Not a pedigree, of course, just a forest mongrel. But I've never met a smarter animal. Gray, shaggy, with intelligent eyes. You can talk to him, and it's just as easy to be silent together. I found him as a pup, half dead, caught in a wolf trap. I nursed him back to health, and he clung to me like a burr. Now, we're inseparable. Even now, we sit on the porch, sipping tea from saucers. The sun is setting, playing gold over the treetops. The beauty is indescribable. The air is clean, smelling of pine, smoke from the stove, and damp leaves. In moments like this, you don't want to think about anything bad. Just sit and breathe deeply. In the city, there's stench and noise, but here it's pure bliss. Well, old man, I speak to the dog, stretched out at my feet on the warm porch boards. Tomorrow at dawn, we'll go on patrol. That wandering bear is rustling around the outlaw swamp again. Heard anything? I saw its track in the mud yesterday. Big, like a saucer. No mistake, an old acquaintance, a grizzly. Taiga twitched his ear, looked at me, and tapped his tail on the ground once or twice, as if saying, "Heard you, old man, loud and clear. We'll go for sure. Can't stand that bear. Tried to grab my pants when I was a pup. Now that he's grown to nearly 100 pounds, he's bold enough to snarl." I smiled and put down the saucer. "You're my little soldier, but don't get too close. He's angry and hungry now. He might bite your ear off." I reached down and scratched behind his ear, and he grunted in pleasure. "You softy," I murmured. "Just let me scratch you." The dog snorted as if offended, yawned, showing his strong yellow teeth, and curled up at my feet, resting his head on his paws. He seemed to say, "I know what I'm doing. We've been living in the forest for years. I respect the bear, but I won't let him have me for lunch." That's our agreement. It's cozy. Not cheerful, no, but peaceful. You know every pine, every anthill, and they know you. The forest notices outsiders. And I'm like an old gnarled stump, part of the landscape. Don't bother anyone, live my life. My cabin isn't rich, but it's sturdy. My grandfather built it from solid timber. 2 windows face the forest, 1 faces the clearing. The roof sags a little, but it doesn't leak. The stove is the heart of the house. In summer, you hardly need it, but from fall to spring, it's a joy. I heat it through the night, and Taiga warms himself on the bed. I don't have many books. All are worn out about nature and animals, just for evening leisure. The next morning, as planned, we were up. I sleep lightly, always have. At 4 o'clock, I wake as if a clock is set in my head. I stoked the stove, cooked oatmeal for myself and Taiga, dropped some pieces of fat into his bowl. While eating, I packed my bag. Cartridges, a small pot, water, a crust of bread with salt. I took down my trusty Tula 12 gauge, wiped it free of dust. Everything as usual, routine. Mist lay on the ground like milk, thick and white. Trees seemed to float in it, ghostly and vague. The air was cold and biting, stinging my cheeks, but pleasant. I walked, the pot jingling on my back, gun on my shoulder. Taiga ahead, sniffing the ground, emerging from the mist, then disappearing into it again like a gray phantom. Sometimes he stops, listening, ears pricked. Everything interests him. We reached the swamp and found the tracks. Large, unmistakable bear tracks. Old ones, from yesterday. The edges had softened, slightly washed away by water. We walked around, searched in a circle. No fresh tracks. Looks like it went further into the backwoods, back onto old wolf trails. Didn't linger. "Well, that's fine," I said to Taiga, sniffing a bush where the bear had evidently scratched, leaving clumps of fur. "Besides, he's old and ragged, good for neither a rug nor a hat." And looked at the dog. "And you, only good for a bed? And probably full of fleas anyway." Tiger wagged his tail, clearly disagreeing with my assessment of potential prey. He would have loved to give chase.
We turned back. The sun was already warming us, dispersing the fog. It curled above the ground, slipping into the lowlands toward the swamp, almost alive. We walked along our path. I softly whistled an old song, one I had heard from my grandfather, about the bright falcon. Taiga chased twigs, startled a crow which cawed indignantly, hopping from branch to branch. Beautiful, in a word. Just an ordinary forest day. I'd had thousands like it. As we approached the hut, I immediately sensed something wrong, even at the edge of the clearing. Not that anything shouted danger. No, I just sensed it. An old habit. A sixth sense, perhaps. I stopped and looked around. Taiga froze too. His ears pricked, sniffing the air, moving his nose from side to side like a radar. The fur on his back lay smooth, but his entire body was tense. "Do you sense it?" I asked quietly, almost in a whisper, not really expecting anything in response. The dog didn't respond clearly, only the fur on his nape slowly, almost imperceptibly, rose like a hedgehog. Then he snorted, shook his head as if brushing off an annoying fly, and trotted toward the porch, wagging his tail and glancing back at me. It seemed to say, "All's well, old man, calm down, stop staring at the air." But I wasn't mistaken. Something hung in the air. Not fear, no, a warning. The forest was strangely tense. Birds were singing, but not as loudly as usual. The air was still. I approached the porch and examined the ground. It's always soft there from the night's moisture, and there was a track. Not a bear's, not a wolf's, and certainly not a human's. A paw-like print, but very large, with long, thin, almost delicate fingers, like dried twigs. Between the toes were web-like impressions, barely noticeable, like those of a waterfowl, goose or duck, but the depth of the print suggested a heavy, massive animal, a moose or the same old bear. But the shape, its shape, was completely alien, unfamiliar. I had never seen anything like it in my life. I stood, staring at the track, feeling a cold, slippery shiver crawl down my spine. An unknown beast in my territory, and it had come right up to the house, standing close under the very window. "All right, Taiga," I said aloud, mostly to myself, to dispel the rising unease. "Maybe some stray otter wandered here, unusual one, from the swamps perhaps, or a giant beaver lost from the river. Hungry, maybe, roaming. Happens." I even tried to smile, but it came out crookedly. The dog looked at me, tilting his head to the side. In his intelligent, understanding eyes, I read complete disagreement. He knew ordinary otters or beavers don't leave tracks like that, and don't come close to huts, to human scent. He would have barked to warn me, but here, only silence, and a single strange track. The rest of the day, I felt off, as if stung by a fly. Chopping wood, I nearly hit my foot. A log slipped, and I barely dodged. Cooking porridge for lunch, I oversalted it. Impossible to eat. Had to make a new batch. I kept approaching the window, staring at that single track. It was alone, right under the porch, nowhere else around. Not the garden, nor the path. As if whoever left it didn't approach or leave, but simply materialized here. Stood and disappeared. Stood here a long time, peering into the dark windows, listening to our conversation with Taiga yesterday, or waiting. By evening, my unease hadn't subsided. It had only grown, like a snowball. I took my rifle, cleaned it again, although it was already clean, checked the cartridges one by one just in case, counted them, 24. Not enough. I'd need more in the village. Taiga lay at the doorstep, keeping his eyes fixed on the forest, on the place where tracks usually lead. And that day, he didn't wag his tail again. He was focused and silent, like a sentry on duty. The night passed anxiously, soaked with anticipation. I tossed and turned on my bed, waking at every rustle, every creak of the floorboards. A branch scraped the roof, my heart leapt. A mouse rustled in the walls. The steps cautious. In the half-light, in the twilight, my imagination began to conjure shapes. Here they were, those very steps, Heavy, slapping, wet, alien. Someone stopped under the window and breathed heavily, with a whistle, as if their lungs were full of holes, and through the gap came the smell of slime and wet fur. Only toward dawn did I drift into an uneasy, heavy sleep, and I dreamed that I was standing on the porch, and from the forest, from behind the farthest dark spruces, two eyes were watching me. Yellow, narrow, slits like a snake's, without eyelids, without brows, just two flat, unblinking spots, glowing with a dull, phosphorescent light, and in them there was no malice, no curiosity, only emptiness, cold, bottomless, cosmic emptiness. And from that emptiness it became so terrifying that it took my breath away. I woke up in a cold sweat. My shirt was soaked through, my heart pounding like crazy, ready to jump out of my chest. Dawn was just breaking. A weak, gray, cheerless light seeped through the window. Taiga was asleep on his worn bedding, but even his sleep was troubled. He whimpered, his paws twitching, occasionally growling quietly, deeply, fighting someone. Apparently the same thing I fought. The thing that came to our forest. I got up, lit the stove. My hands were shaking. The match wouldn't light. I broke 3 before I got a flame. Put the kettle on. Decided to step onto the porch, breathe in some freshness, shake off the remnants of the nightmare, and froze, my gaze turning cold as I saw the ground. Tracks. They were many. Not 1, not 2. They encircled the cabin in a perfectly even, almost unnatural, precise ring. Deep, clear, pressed into the earth with force, with those same long, terrifying fingers and webbing. Someone had walked around my home all night, walked and walked without rest, methodically. And we, both I and Taiga, exhausted by daytime tension and nightly nightmares, had slept through this procession, this circling. I looked at the forest. It stood gray, silent, impenetrable in the morning haze, ordinary, familiar down to each branch, each stump with its honey mushrooms. But now, in its depths, beyond that fence of trunks, in its darkest, dampest thickets, lurked something new, something alien, something that wasn't afraid to approach a human dwelling, something that clearly carried nothing good, nothing except that chilling, inexplicable emptiness from my dream. And for the first time in 40 years, through all my lonely nights and meetings with the masters of the taiga, through all the stories my grandfather told me, I became truly, to the bone, to trembling knees, to nausea in my throat, afraid. Not animal fear, but human, conscious fear. Since then, the tracks appeared every night, always at dawn, always in a circle. I tried keeping watch, sat by the window with my rifle on my knees, strong tea beside me to stay awake. My eyes stuck together, my body ached from sitting still, but I forced myself to stay alert, staring into the shadows beyond the glass. Taiga sat nearby, ears perked, staring into the darkness as if trying to burn through it with his gaze. Sometimes he growled quietly, very low, almost inaudibly, only a vibration running through his body. It was not the growl he used to greet a bear or a wolf. This was something else, a warning mixed with hatred and fear. But the single moment I nodded off, lowered my head, or got distracted by the crackling of the stove wood, at dawn I would find those fresh, insolent prints on the ground again, as if the uninvited guest knew, sensed, when my will weakened, when my eyelids closed by themselves. It came at those exact minutes. It was playing with me. I didn't like this game at all, and I tried to think logically, just as my grandfather taught me. Fear comes from not knowing. Learn your enemy, and you've done half the job. And if you don't know who the enemy is, look for tracks, study habits. Maybe it really was some rare, protected animal that escaped from somewhere. A wolverine,
No, a wolverine's track is different, and it rarely approaches human dwellings, a cautious animal, and they hadn't lived in our area for about 100 years. Maybe a limping moose with a split hoof, leaving strange prints that way? But no, the shape is wrong. And a moose, even wounded, won't walk in circles around a cabin. A boar? No, wrong again. A boar moves straight ahead, bursting through bushes, not sneaking around at night.
I went through all the forest dwellers in my mind, from squirrel to lynx, from badger to ermine. None fit. Only one thing remained: a stranger, an outsider, an intruder from places even I, an old gamekeeper, had never ventured into. And that thought made me even more uneasy. There was only one thing worse than a known enemy: an unknown one. One especially tense morning, after an almost sleepless night, I poured Taiga his broth into a bowl and set it in its usual place by the stove. Usually, he would pounce on his food with greedy appetite, smacking and licking. But that time, the dog only walked up lazily, sniffed the food, touched the meat with his nose, but didn't eat. He only looked at me with his loyal, tired eyes and gave a quiet, plaintive howl, softly, nasally, as if warning about a danger he couldn't express in words. There was such despair and helplessness in that sound that my heart tightened. "What's wrong with you, silly one?" I tried to calm him down as I sat at the table with a plate of steaming potatoes. My voice sounded hoarse and tired. "Eat while it's hot. Don't be picky. You're not some nobleman's poodle, after all." But Taiga moved away from the bowl, pushing it with his nose so it clattered, and lay down by the door, placing his muzzle on his paws, not taking his eyes off the forest. And then I understood completely. He sensed something he had never sensed in his entire dog life. Not a beast, not a bird, something entirely different. This primal, ancient fear coming from the depths of centuries passed from him to me, chilling my fingers. A familiar, icy shiver ran down my spine. I began noticing other, more frightening and obvious things. In the mornings on the walls of the cabin, especially near the windows, long, shallow, but very clear scratches began appearing, as if someone had run a dry, stiff branch along the rough old wood, pressing it in with force. I ran my finger along them. Rough, but not deep. Not an attempt to break in, no, more like study or marking. One day, after an especially cold night when the windows were covered inside with intricate frost patterns, I was wiping them with a cloth and saw at the very bottom a strange, blurry print. I looked closer. It was long, bony, with a sharp, curved, almost sickle-like claw at the end. It wasn't a paw, it was almost a hand, just far too long. And all four fingers were disproportionately thin and long, with the thumb short and thick, set aside. The creature clearly leaned on the glass, pressing its face close to it. I wiped the print away with my palm, quickly, almost with disgust, and the shiver ran across my skin again, as if I had touched something dead, cold, and defiled. It wasn't just walking around, examining my home from outside. It was trying to look inside, trying to understand who lived here, what was here, or searching for a way to get inside. That thought was the most terrifying. The coziness of my cabin drained away like water into sand, irretrievably and quickly. Now, in the evenings, even before dusk, I didn't just lock the door with the latch, I propped it with a massive, heavy log that had once only been used for splitting firewood. I shut the windows with shutters, checking every hinge, every hook, so the wind wouldn't blow them off. The rifle always stood in the corner by the bed, visible.
The ammunition belt hung on the nail nearby so I could grab everything in one motion without losing precious seconds. Talking to Taiga became harder. Our former light, almost friendly jokes somehow faded away on their own, buried under the growing tension like a snow avalanche. Now our conversations were short, abrupt, and full of anxious, unspoken meaning. "Do you hear that?" I would whisper to him at night when, beyond the thin wooden wall, suspicious rustling or a quiet, wet slap sounded. Taiga only growled deeply and gutturally in response, baring his teeth, but he didn't rush to the door. He seemed to understand that behind it stood something he couldn't defeat with a frontal attack. His fur rarely relaxed, constantly bristling along his withers and backbone. He became the shadow of my anxiety, my living barometer of fear. One day, I decided I'd had enough of passive waiting. I needed to act. I took the old, ancient traps, my grandfather's old man traps, not to catch it.
No, I wasn't sure they would hold something like that, but I needed to understand, to see, to get physical proof that it wasn't a mirage, not a trick of a sick imagination. I set them around the perimeter on those very paths where the tracks usually appeared, especially thickly under the windows, and masked them well with branches and last year's leaves. Then I went back into the cabin, sat by the window in the dark, and began to wait, listening to the night. Several hours passed. Nothing. Only an owl hooted somewhere far away, and occasionally the trees creaked. I had already begun to nod off when suddenly, outside, right under the window, there was a loud metallic clang, and immediately after it a piercing, inhuman hissing, grinding sound. Taiga howled and rushed to the door. I jumped up and grabbed the rifle. My heart was hammering somewhere in my throat. I waited a minute or two. No more sounds. With a sinking heart, rifle ready, I moved the log aside and threw the door open. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted, but in the gray light I saw something that froze my blood in my veins. The trap, the very one I had placed under the window, had been ripped from its place and thrown a couple of meters away, and it was broken. The thick steel tooth, the springs had been torn out, as if they hadn't been made from high-carbon steel, but from plasticine. The other traps set around the circle had simply been tossed aside, some bent. The creature had not been caught. It destroyed them, broke them, and didn't even bother to hide it. It had demonstrated its strength, its contempt for my tricks. I came closer and picked up the torn trap. It was heavy, cold, deadly in my hands. And on the metal at the base of the broken tooth, I saw a dark, almost black dried lump. Something like resin, but with a sharp, sour chemical smell that made my eyes water. I rubbed it with my fingers and they became sticky, as if smeared with caustic glue. It was blood. And I had wounded it. Even a little, even just a scratch, but it was its blood, which meant it could be killed. That evening, for the first time in a long while, I lit a fire in front of the cabin. Not for warmth, the stove was heated plenty, but for light. The fire crackled brightly, throwing long, dancing, living shadows across the forest, pushing the impenetrable darkness back by a few steps. Taiga sat beside me, pressed against my side, and I could feel him trembling slightly. We both, without saying a word, stared into the blackness beyond the circle of light, the very darkness where our unseen shadow lurked. And then, from that blackness, from behind the trunk of an old aspen, came a sound. Not a growl, not a howl, a quiet, hissing, bubbling whisper. Without words, without meaning, just a flow of air pushed through something sharp, narrow, and wet. It was filled with such ancient, senseless hatred and hunger that my hair stood up under my hat. A cold sweat ran down my back.
Taiga leapt up with a deafening, furious bark, rushed to the edge of the light, but didn't step into the darkness. He knew the boundary. He stood at the very edge, bristling, head low, barking himself hoarse at the point where that whisper had come from. His bark was full of challenge and despair. I raised the rifle, pressed the stock to my shoulder. "Come out!" I shouted, and my voice, usually firm and calm, trembled and broke into a falsetto. "Show yourself, creature!" In response, silence. Deep, ringing, crushing. Even the frogs in the marsh, who usually held their nightly concerts, suddenly fell quiet. Even the wind, which had been gently stirring the leaves, stilled. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting for the outcome. Then, in the thicket, right behind that same aspen, something rustled loudly with a dry, bony crack. Branches snapped, and the sounds began to move away quickly, dissolving into the depths of the taiga.
I slowly lowered the shotgun. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The campfire was dying, casting shorter and weaker shadows. Taiga, still growling, barked once more into the darkness and came back to me. He pressed his muzzle against my knee, seeking comfort and protection. We stood like that together, listening as the unseen, yet now almost tangible presence withdrew back into the forest. But I knew it wouldn't be for long. It had only been testing us, probing, and now it knew we feared it, and it knew I could hurt it. That night, in that hissing whisper, echoed through my soul with an icy resonance that I knew would never fall silent again. A week passed, maybe more. I had already lost track of the days. They blended into one continuous gray stretch of anxious waiting. Life had turned into a routine of fear. Wake up with a tremor in my chest, go to the window, see fresh tracks, curse them under my breath, feed Taiga, who still refused to eat, sit by the window with the shotgun, stare into the forest, doze off in brief snatches, wake up again at every rustle. And so on, in circles. The cabin, once my fortress and refuge, had become a cage, a trap someone was methodically circling over and over. Taiga had lost a lot of weight. His ribs showed through the gray fur, his eyes looked larger, wiser, and filled with such exhaustion and strain it hurt to look at. He barely ate, only drank water in large, desperate gulps. He spent all his time at the door or the window, tense like a drawn bowstring, ready to spring at any moment. Sometimes he whimpered softly, almost humanly, staring at the same spot in the forest, deep in the young spruce thicket at the edge of the clearing, as if he saw something hidden from my old, faded eyes. I strained and squinted, but all I saw was the ordinary forest, ordinary trees. But he saw an enemy. I barely slept myself. I dozed in short bursts, sitting on a chair by the stove with the shotgun across my knees. The moment I lay down, it felt as though something was scraping on the roof, something rustling along the walls, or that same shadow appearing behind the window pane. My face grew covered with rough gray stubble. My eyes, ringed with dark circles, sunk deep. I had begun to look like my own exhausted shadow. My strength drained away, day by day, melting like snow under the spring sun. And I understood this couldn't go on much longer. Either I would lose my mind, or it would decide to do more. One night, after an especially grueling day, I finally gave in. Sleep, heavy and irresistible, overwhelmed me, and I collapsed onto the bed without undressing, without even taking off my boots. My shotgun rested at the headboard. The last thing I remembered was Taiga's anxious breathing by the door. And then I had a nightmare, vivid as life. I was walking through the forest, along my familiar trail, but it looked twisted, warped, unfamiliar. The trees creaked and whispered in some strange language, stretching bony, crooked branches toward me. And something followed behind me. I couldn't see it, but I heard it. Heavy, wet, slapping footsteps that made my blood freeze.
and that loud wheezing breathing like an old broken pump. I ran, stumbling over roots that seemed to reach for my feet. The thorny branches whipped my face, scratching it to blood, and it was getting closer. Its breath was already burning the back of my head, and that whisper, that same slithering, gurgling whisper, was forming something like words, like my name, right behind me. I woke up to Taiga's explosive, frantic barking. Not a warning bark, but a furious, battle-ready roar filled with deadly hatred. The dog rushed to the door, claws scraping across the floor, jumping back and hurling himself forward again as if trying to break through the wood with his chest. I jumped to my feet as scalded, my heart pounding in my throat and temples. I grabbed the shotgun. The cabin was pitch dark. The clock on the table, ticking like a madman, showed nearly midnight, the deepest hour of the night. And then the door shuddered from a massive, terrifying blow. Not a knock, not a scratch, a blow. A dull, heavy impact, as if a log swung by a giant had slammed into it. The wood cracked in the middle with a dry, wrenching sound. The latch, a thick iron bar, screeched, holding on with its last strength and bending like a bow. Taiga roared. He leapt up to the doorframe itself, trying to bite into the widening crack.
Another blow, even stronger. The door bent inward, splinters burst from the crack, paint scattered. Through the widening gap I saw a patch of night, and within it something dark, shifting, massive. "Back, Taiga! To me!" I shouted, my voice breaking, and raised the shotgun, aiming at the center of the door. The third strike, the worst of all, came. The door couldn't withstand it. With a crash like an explosion, it burst open, tearing off one of its hinges and hanging, crookedly, hideously. In the doorway, flooded with moonlight that suddenly poured into the cabin, a figure appeared. It was here. For the first time, not in tracks, not in whispers, not in nightmares, but in the flesh. It stood taller than a man, nearly 2 meters, thin, almost dried out, yet not fragile. Its body was covered in dark, slimy-looking, partly glistening hide. In some places, long, tangled hair hung in matted clumps like swamp moss. Its long, disproportionately large arms almost dragged on the floor, ending in those very same hands with thin, grasping fingers and long, sickle-curved claws that threw pale moonlit reflections across the floor. The head was elongated, noseless, only 2 black, bottomless pits where nostrils should be, and its eyes were horizontal, narrow like those of a viper, glowing with a dim, sickly yellow light, like 2 pieces of rotting phosphorus. They were devoid of expression, except for cold, hungry emptiness. It reeked of rotting bog water, wet fur, and something else, metallic like old dried blood. The smell hit me like a thick, tangible wall. It hissed, opening a maw lined with rows of sharp, needle-like, tightly packed teeth. The sound was like red-hot metal plunged into water. I fired almost without aiming, purely by instinct. The blast inside the small cabin was deafening. The muzzle flash lit up the monstrous scene. The bullet, as it seemed to me, hit its shoulder, closer to the neck. Thick, nearly black blood splattered across the doorframe and wall. The creature jerked back, letting out a short, shrill, unbearably piercing sound, like a rusty saw dragged across glass. But it didn't fall. It shook itself like a dog, and its yellow eyes narrowed even further, fixing on me with a new, furious, personal hatred. I had wounded it, but not killed it. Taiga didn't hesitate. Seeing the shot fail to stop the monster, he lunged forward. He sank his teeth into the creature's leg, right where the tendons were, growling deeply, tearing into the flesh. This time, it roared for real, like an animal, and wrenched its limb, throwing the dog aside effortlessly, like a rag, across the cabin. Taiga hit the logs with a dull, muffled thud and went still, not making a sound. "Taiga!" I shouted, and my voice carried not only pain, but a fury that drowned out fear. I backed towards the stove, groping behind me for the axe hanging in its place. The creature stepped inside, crossing the threshold. It filled the entire room. It seemed its head brushed the ceiling. Its twisted, horn-like shadow danced across the walls in the moonlight, pouring through the broken doorway. It moved awkwardly, twitching, but terrifyingly fast on its long legs. Those sickly yellow eyes never left me. I backed up until my spine pressed against the woodpile. There was nowhere else to retreat. My hand found the familiar handle of the axe. I managed to wrench it off the hook right as the creature's long, bony, ice-cold clawed hand lunged toward my throat. I blocked the strike with the back of the axe. A claw rang off the steel, sending a spark flying. The creature hissed, sensing the iron. It hated it, feared it. I seized the moment and made a desperate, wide lunge, aiming at the center, the place where a heart should be. The axe sunk into something tough, rubbery, but not deep, as if I were chopping into an old tar-soaked stump. Thick, black blood poured on the floor and over my boots. The stench intensified. The monster howled, in pain and fury, a sound that made the remaining window panes tremble. Its second hand shot forward like lightning, grabbing my left shoulder, right above the scar from the trap. Claws sharp as razors sunk into my flesh, cutting through the padded jacket and shirt like paper. I screamed as my skin tore and a burning, freezing cold spread down my arm. Another blow, even stronger. The door bent inward, splinters burst from the crack, paint scattered. Through the widening gap I saw a patch of night, and within it something dark, shifting, massive. "Back, taiga! To me!" I shouted, my voice breaking, and raised the shotgun, aiming at the center of the door. The third strike, the worst of all, came. The door couldn't withstand it. With a crash like an explosion, it burst open, tearing off one of its hinges and hanging, crookedly, hideously. In the doorway, flooded with moonlight that suddenly poured into the cabin, a figure appeared. It was here. For the first time, not in tracks, not in whispers, not in nightmares, but in the flesh. It stood taller than a man, nearly 2 meters, thin, almost dried out, yet not fragile. Its body was covered in dark, slimy-looking, partly glistening hide. In some places, long, tangled hair hung in matted clumps like swamp moss. Its long, disproportionately large arms almost dragged on the floor, ending in those very same hands with thin, grasping fingers and long, sickle-curved claws that threw pale moonlit reflections across the floor. The head was elongated, noseless, only 2 black, bottomless pits where nostrils should be, and its eyes were horizontal, narrow like those of a viper, glowing with a dim, sickly yellow light, like 2 pieces of rotting phosphorus. They were devoid of expression, except for cold, hungry emptiness. It reeked of rotting bog water, wet fur, and something else, metallic like old dried blood. The smell hit me like a thick, tangible wall. It hissed, opening a maw lined with rows of sharp, needle-like, tightly packed teeth. The sound was like red-hot metal plunged into water. I fired almost without aiming, purely by instinct. The blast inside the small cabin was deafening. The muzzle flash lit up the monstrous scene. The bullet, as it seemed to me, hit its shoulder, closer to the neck. Thick, nearly black blood splattered across the doorframe and wall. The creature jerked back, letting out a short, shrill, unbearably piercing sound, like a rusty saw dragged across glass. But it didn't fall. It shook itself like a dog, and its yellow eyes narrowed even further, fixing on me with a new, furious, personal hatred. I had wounded it, but not killed it. Taiga didn't hesitate. Seeing the shot fail to stop the monster, he lunged forward. He sank his teeth into the creature's leg, right where the tendons were, growling deeply, tearing into the flesh. This time, it roared for real, like an animal, and wrenched its limb, throwing the dog aside effortlessly, like a rag, across the cabin. Taiga hit the logs with a dull, muffled thud and went still, not making a sound. "Taiga!" I shouted, and my voice carried not only pain, but a fury that drowned out fear. I backed towards the stove, groping behind me for the axe hanging in its place. The creature stepped inside, crossing the threshold. It filled the entire room. It seemed its head brushed the ceiling. Its twisted, horn-like shadow danced across the walls in the moonlight, pouring through the broken doorway. It moved awkwardly, twitching, but terrifyingly fast on its long legs. Those sickly yellow eyes never left me. I backed up until my spine pressed against the wood pile. There was nowhere else to retreat. My hand found the familiar handle of the axe. I managed to wrench it off the hook right as the creature's long, bony, ice-cold clawed hand lunged toward my throat. I blocked the strike with the back of the axe. A claw rang off the steel, sending a spark flying. The creature hissed, sensing the iron. It hated it, feared it. I seized the moment and made a desperate, wide lunge, aiming at the center, the place where a heart should be. The axe sunk into something tough, rubbery, but not deep, as if I were chopping into an old tar-soaked stump. Thick, black blood poured on the floor and over my boots. The stench intensified. The monster howled, in pain and fury, a sound that made the remaining window panes tremble. Its second hand shot forward like lightning, grabbing my left shoulder, right above the scar from the trap. Claws sharp as razors sunk into my flesh, cutting through the padded jacket and shirt like paper. I screamed as my skin tore and a burning, freezing cold spread down my arm.
The back of its head had been partially blown apart by a point-blank shot, and from the wound, the same black mass was oozing out. The eyes, those same yellow slits, had gone dim, turning into cloudy, grayish patches. It smelled even worse now. To the stench of rot and blood was added a sickly, sweet reek of decay, the smell of entrails. Taiga crawled closer to me, dragging his hind leg. A deep, terrible gash gaped along his side. The fur around it had been torn out, but it looked like the bones were intact. He was breathing heavily, but there was relief in his eyes. We were alike in that moment. Two battered, graying, bloodied old men, drained of strength, who had somehow survived a fight with the unknown. Two old wolves separated from the pack, barely escaping hunters. We had to move, gather what was left of our will. I was afraid, but it was no longer the same irrational terror of the invisible. It was a sober, cold fear. What if it wasn't alone? What if more were lurking somewhere in the forest? Or what if it was the male, and the female, sensing her mate's death, would come seeking revenge? The forest no longer held an abstract threat. It was a very real one, and I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Summoning everything I had left, I forced myself to my feet. The world swam before my eyes, my temples throbbed, but I stayed upright, gripping the edge of the table. First thing, the door. I had to close the opening somehow, restore at least the illusion of safety. The sight of the empty doorway leading into the night, into that forest where something else might be hiding, ate at my nerves. With tremendous effort, using my one good shoulder, I dragged the broken, torn-off door aside. Then I went to the shed where all sorts of junk were stored. There was an old oak door there, never used. My grandfather had kept it as a spare. It was incredibly heavy. I broke into a sweat, cursing everything, gritting my teeth against the pain in my shoulder, and dragged it to the cabin, pulling it along the ground. I set it into the doorway. It sat poorly, with wide gaps, but it was sturdy. I propped it with the same block of wood that had once held the old door. My home was once again, if not reliably, then at least somewhat shielded from prying eyes and from the wind that heralded rain. Then I tended to myself, the hardest part. Gritting my teeth, I crawled to the bucket of water and filled a ladle.
There wasn't much water left, but there was no choice. I poured it over the wound, washing away blood and dirt. The water was icy. For a moment, it dulled the pain, only for it to return with new force. I bandaged myself with whatever I could, tore an old but clean sheet into strips, tightened it around the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. My hands trembled, my fingers barely obeyed. Then I somehow managed to bandage the cut on my cheek. It wasn't deep, but it burned like fire. I checked on Taiga as well. He lay there, breathing heavily, watching me with loyal eyes. His leg was swollen, but not broken to the touch. I washed the gash on his side, bandaged it with cloth. He endured it, only whining softly when I touched the worst spots. We were now brothers in misfortune, in blood and in pain. Then both of us, exhausted and drained, collapsed. I fell onto the bed, Taiga curled up on his mat by the stove. I couldn't sleep, though my body begged for rest. I lay staring at the ceiling where the candle flame flickered from the wind. I listened to Taiga breathing heavily with a rasp and felt myself trembling, a small, uncontrollable shiver. Not from fear anymore, but from the weight of everything that had fallen on us, from the adrenaline leaving my body, from realizing what we had survived. In the morning, when pale, rainy light seeped through the cracks in the new door and the shutters, I finally forced myself to approach the body. It couldn't be put off any longer. The smell was becoming unbearable. It lay exactly as it had in the night. In the gray, dull daylight, it looked even more revolting, even more alien. The skin wasn't just dark. It was gray, earthy, like rotting wood, covered in warty, bone-like growths, especially along the spine and joints. The long, webbed fingers looked even more unnatural, almost extraterrestrial. An even stronger, sickly, sweet, putrid stench now emanated from it, suffocating, breaking through even the smell of blood and gunpowder. I didn't know what it was. Not a mutated bear, not a man-beast from scary folk tales, something ancient, forest-born, that perhaps had always lived here. In the most remote, impassable thickets, by the bogs, in underground dens, and in 40 years I had never crossed its path. Or maybe it had come from somewhere else, from those forbidden places grandfather used to speak of in a superstitious whisper, where even he sometimes refused to go. Places where the earth collapses, where
An even stronger, sickly sweet, putrid stench now emanated from it, suffocating, breaking through even the smell of blood and gunpowder. I didn't know what it was. Not a mutated bear, not a man-beast from scary folk tales, something ancient, forest-born, that perhaps had always lived here, in the most remote, impassable thickets, by the bogs, in underground dens, and in 40 years I had never crossed its path. Or maybe it had come from somewhere else, from those forbidden places grandfather used to speak of in a superstitious whisper, where even he sometimes refused to go. Places where the earth collapses, where crooked, sickly trees grow and birds do not sing. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was dead, and that I had to remove it, erase the traces of that night, cross it out of reality as much as possible. Taking a shovel, I stepped outside the cabin. The air was damp and cold. It smelled of rain and wet earth. Birds were singing, but hesitantly, as if afraid. It seemed the forest was breathing with relief, but still not fully believing in its own liberation. The rain was just starting. Heavy, sparse drops fell from the sky, drumming on leaves and on the roof. I chose a place beneath an old, wide-branched spruce, 200 steps from the house, far from paths and from the garden. A secluded, shadowed, damp place. The soil there was soft. I began to dig. Every swing of the shovel sent fiery pain through my shoulder. I dug with clenched teeth, grinding them from strain, covered in sweat that mixed with rainwater and the blood seeping through the bandage. I dug as if burying not just the carcass, but the very fear, the very horror that had entered my life. This was my final task for the uninvited guest. The last thing I could do for it. The pit turned out deep, more than 2 meters, so no animal could dig it up. I grew more exhausted than I had ever been in my life.
Returning to the cabin, I threw the old oilcloth tarp over it so I wouldn't touch it and dragged it toward the pit. It was surprisingly heavy, dense, like a chunk of wet oak. I walked, stumbling, falling, getting back up, dragging this burden across the wet grass. I pushed it into the pit along with the cloths, the splinters from the door, everything that had been stained with that black ooze. When I covered it with earth and tamped the ground down with my boots, I placed a large, shapeless boulder on top to mark the spot and to prevent digging. I felt such weariness, such emptiness, that I barely made it back home. My arms and legs wouldn't obey. A haze clouded my vision. Epilogue. 5 years passed. Exactly 5 years since that terrible night. Snow came early this year, and now my forest stands white, clean, as if it had been washed and hung to dry under the sun just yesterday. The frost bites the cheeks, but kindly, in the winter way. I sit on the porch step, which I rebuilt last year, and drink tea. Not from a saucer anymore, but from a mug. Old bones prefer warmth. Taiga is stretched out by my feet on his worn but harmed rug. His muzzle has gone gray, and on his side, under the thick fur, the same scar is still visible. He limps a little, especially in the mornings, but it doesn't affect the hunt. He still drives hares with the same enthusiasm. True, he can't catch them anymore, but he tries. That boulder beneath the old wide-branched spruce is long covered in moss and has almost merged with the ground. I sometimes go there, not out of fear or nightmares, those have faded, like a sun-bleached photograph, just to stand there quietly, to say thank you, to the forest for sparing us, and to the one whose remains lie there for the lesson. It was harsh, but necessary. I understood that my home isn't the walls, but everything around me. The taiga, the tea in my mug, the crunch of snow underfoot, the painfully familiar stars overhead. After that story, I did go to the village, not for cartridges, but just to talk. I told the forestry guys one story about a rogue bear that had come to the cabin. Didn't lie, really, just left something out. They shook their heads and said, "Yegor, you should move to the village. It's not safe for an old man alone in the taiga." I only smirked into my mustache. What danger is there when the worst is already behind you? No one has come to us since. No claws, no hissing. The forest seemed to calm down, to accept us back. Perhaps that last guest was the last of its kind, or maybe the others realized that here lives not just an old man, but Yegor the ranger who will defend his home to his last cartridge. Either way, the silence here is now the most blessed kind. Taiga sighed deeply in his sleep and rolled onto his other side, exposing his belly to the weak winter sun. I stretched, cracked my knuckles. Time to chop wood and cook some soup. Life is a simple thing when you think about it. All you need is a roof over your head and someone loyal nearby. The rest is fuss. That's my whole story. It was frightening, yes, but it ended well, which means I can tell it calmly now, like a bedtime story. Only you shouldn't tell children stories like that. They'll get scared. But we old folks, what is there to fear? Taiga and I have already fought our battle. Now all that's left is to drink tea, watch over the forest, and live. Just live. And that, you know, is the greatest victory.